particular, because of their joint venture relationship, that is, they're on the political level as well as the economic level, it's very difficult for workers when they do have demonstrations or strikes or whatever, to know exactly who the enemy is. Is it Walmart? Well, Walmart doesn't own any of the factories. Is it the factory owner himself? Well, he may be in or out of business in a little while. Is it the local political establishment? Well, yes, that may be the case as well. Meanwhile, there's the All China Federation of Trade Unions. What about them? What about that? Well, a lot of debate on the American left and labor about the nature of that institution. I would just say it's an institution which is rotten at the top and the bottom. But in the middle, there's something interesting. The top is totally tied into the Communist Party apparatus, and I had lunch at the All China Federation of Trade Union headquarters in Beijing like 2 weeks after Andy Stern was there. It was an excellent lunch. That's the problem. The lunch was too good. Okay. At the bottom, it's rotten because there the union they're appointed by the local, factory. The union representative is tied into the local factory owner or the Wal-Mart store manager, and they're just part of the local management apparatus. But in the middle, there are real people, real what do you call them, functionaries, who can see that unless something's done to get the All China Federation into the supplier factories, it will become irrelevant. And that's the worst possible thing. So how are they going to become relevant? Do something. So that's sort of in that middle level. And I met some of them at a conference in Beijing 9 months ago, which, we'll see what happens there. That's sort of my perspective on that. Actually, I think I'll stop now and you have questions.
Next, we have the author of this particular book, Gay Seidman, and she handed me the book. She said, read it so you can make useful comments. I'm in favor. From the University of Wisconsin, and the book just came out this year, yes? Or last year, 2007. Okay, go.
So I have to say that I never thought that a talk on Wal-Mart would have done a happy note. So I'm totally impressed. Well, it was, not pessimistic. Okay, only if I can figure out where my slides are. I have a little trouble seeing it. All right. So I'm sorry about the line here. I didn't know that was going to happen. Okay. All right. So I started working on this book a couple years ago when discussions about globalization began to suggest that consumer pressure could be used for creating a global governance system that could create a regulatory pressure on corporations. And in fact, part of that discussion was coming here to a conference that Margaret organized. Was it 2002? Something like that. Anyway, the idea that often came up in early discussions about monitoring and trade was that somehow ethical consumers could, as we discussed over the last few days, and I think as Richard suggested, could sort of punish corporations that didn't treat their workers well by refusing, tarnish the brand, tarnish the image, and corporations would want to behave better and to please their own subcontractors. Obviously, as I think Dan Jacoby mentioned, this leads to an information problem. Does the label really mean anything? So there was increasing discussions through the late 90s about what independent monitoring would look like and how we could hold companies accountable for the codes of conduct that they claimed that they were using. Actually, this has become so standard that last year when the Gap got caught with a 10-year-old, or a 10-year-old was found working, actually it was by Indian labor activists in New Delhi, not a transnational campaign, but they showed us the world and the world was interested. It took less than a week for the Gap to say, okay, we're going to submit to independent monitoring, and instead of trying to police it ourselves, we're going to bring in outside monitors. I think this really underscores how much independent monitoring has become the gold standard in discussions about fair trade practices. I was particularly interested in this because I had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Somebody else here said they were at Harvard in the 70s. So was I, and I was involved in anti-apartheid stuff. And the Sullivan Principles, which monitored American companies which were invested in South Africa, are often cited today as the first example of independent monitoring. And I have been stunned by this because we hated the Sullivan Principles. We thought they were corporate camouflage, and we thought they were a totally bogus corporate cover-up for participating, for being complicit in apartheid. So I thought it would be interesting to go back and look at the Sullivan Principles and see whether maybe we had missed something, maybe they were better than we thought. So I went and looked, and actually I thought they were worse than we thought. So then I thought it would be really interesting to compare that independent monitoring process to two more recent success stories and try to figure out what were the key characteristics that would make for successful monitoring so that we could have some standard to judge independent monitoring by, so that we wouldn't have a case where, you know, we're sewing on labels that say fair and square, where the consumers were really well-intentioned by the label and don't know whether there's any monitoring behind it. So I looked at 3 cases in the book. I looked carefully at the Sullivan Principles, then I looked at Wal-Mart, which looks at it's a very famous social labeling scheme that puts labels on carpets on which the looms of which have been monitored to make sure there's no children working on a loom in India. And then in the apparel industry, I looked at a group called Coverca, which is affiliated or was certified. It's both the FLA and the WOC at various points have said that they would work with it. So I looked at the 3 of them. So what I want to do now is first show some common patterns in the kinds of transnational campaigns that lead to monitoring, then talk a little bit about some common patterns in monitoring, and then I want to look at each of the cases very quickly to talk about some questions that each of them raises before I talk about citizenship a little bit. Okay, so here is a comparative table of the transnational campaigns. How does enough pressure get mounted on companies to get them to accede to multi-stakeholder or independent monitoring that is not an accounting firm, not an internal office? You know, how do you get them to open their factory doors to an NGO which monitors? Well, the most sort of obvious commonality across all 3 campaigns, and I have to tell you that none of them ended up looking as successful as I thought they would at the beginning, so I never did get to say this is the most important characteristic. All of them began around human rights issues, and I think it's really worth stopping to think about what kinds of grievances attract international attention. It is really hard to mobilize mass consumer attention around issues like forced bathroom breaks. It takes someone who's already pretty attentive to labor issues to think about that stuff. And so each of these campaigns were really part of much larger campaigns around issues that really involved violence to vulnerable victims. In almost every case, it involved actually physical violence. In the case of South Africa, obviously, most anti-apartheid activists weren't concerned as much about workplace grievances as about much larger issues of human rights and racial discrimination. And workplace discrimination was only a small part of it. The Sullivan Principles were organized around integrating the canteens and training black workers for more skilled jobs, a very small part of the kinds of grievances that actually motivated the transnational campaign. In the same way, Wal-Mart actually emerged out of a much larger campaign around child labor. The carpet industry is only a tiny part of India's child labor problem. And in fact, there's much more child labor in agriculture and in the informal sector than there is in the formal sector. But the carpet industry moved on loom monitoring because it became a sort of international. There was a particular case of some kidnapped children that became an international symbol of child labor, and so the carpet industry moved to create this monitoring scheme to prevent further abuses. In Guatemala, I think anyone who knows the history of labor monitoring in Guatemala knows how it emerged during a peace process as Guatemala moved out of a very bloody civil war, a much broader set of issues. Labor violations became part of that transition. In the course of monitoring the peace process, human rights groups began to monitor labor issues as a smaller part of a broader process of creating a democratic state. So I think in each case, monitoring emerges. The campaigns that make monitoring work in this way come out of much broader issues than labor issues. And I think all of us need to think about how we reconstruct our issues to reach broad audiences and what that means for the redefinition of labor rights and how transnational activists tend to redirect attention towards issues that will appeal to international audiences, perhaps away from the things that that local workers would themselves be concerned about, although that's debatable. A couple other things I want to point out. It was never individual consumer pressure that led to any of these cases. In each case, it's institutional actors, churches, universities, municipalities,